The secret ceremony where somber men become mafiosi, vowing to live and die by the knife and the gun. A mysterious world of shifting alliances and blood oaths, reminders in the flames that they are doomed if they break the code of omerta, the vow of silence. They are the only secret criminal brotherhood, the Mafia. Only an Italian can belong. It is the key to their takeover of organized crime. But ultimately, it all comes down to murder and money. The Mafia controls by fear, a fear that has its roots in the parched soil of Sicily. The Mafia flourished in Sicily during the century of political upheaval and disorder between Napoleon and Mussolini. Economic conditions were grim, brought on by the Italian government's total neglect of this island.
During that 100 years, there wasn't much real government in Sicily. And so the Mafia arises as a mediator between the citizens on the ground in Sicily and the distant governments that were out of reach, beyond reach, and corrupt. The Sicilians were pretty much kicked around in those days. And so there was a tradition of seeing the law as distant and unfriendly and beyond reach. The saying was, the law works against people.
So respected local men took control, creating their own rules. The poor turned to these men because they stood up to the government and met the needs of their village. These local men became the functioning government of a village. It was the local don who drew up contracts, arranged marriages, loaned money, mediated disputes, and chose police chiefs and judges. Young Salvatore Lucchini, later known as Lucky Luciano, was accustomed to seeing men of respect in their expensive suits walking the piazza, receiving the homage of his neighborhood. By 1880, the men of respect, or Mafia, secretly ruled Sicily. They had infiltrated the local police, the army, and all branches of government. Honest government officials who tried to combat the Mafia were invariably murdered. Lucky's father, Antonio, heard that in America, he could earn more in one day than he could in 1 month in the sulfur mines.
So they come here essentially for economic opportunity, and they try to recreate the old conditions that they knew at home. Here they are in this strange land with its strange mores and strange language. The Mafia is familiar, and it has its own code of honor, a code that is often breached, but still the code is there. For example, that one mafiosi could not mess with the wife of another mafiosi. And if such happened, then the man who had been cuckolded had the right to kill the seducer. Well, that's not allowed in American customs, but it was part of the Mafia code.
The Mafia's a criminal gang. They're a bunch of thugs and murderers, but they are giving their members a sense of stability in the face of this country where everything is progress and change. The underside is that it means they're not assimilated into America, and that sets them up for the Mafia. The Mafia had first surfaced in America in New Orleans, just after the Civil War, amid conditions of political chaos because of Reconstruction. Once again, the Mafia appears because the Italian immigrants need some mediating force between them and the government. And the Mafia steps into that breach while also committing crimes. It's always doing both. 2 Mafia families successfully transplanted themselves from Sicily. Soon they were battling for control of the lucrative shipyards and vegetable markets and were encroaching upon local politics. One Mafia member, Vincenzo Otumbo, was disgruntled at having been cut out of the group's spoils and threatened to go to the authorities. On January 24th, 1889, his throat was slit while playing cards. Police Chief David Hennessy led an investigation. He was the first in the U.S. to learn of the Mafia's existence. He openly criticized Italians, boldly stating he had no use for them. On October 15, 1890, he was shot and killed in front of his house. The press screamed for vengeance. The police embarked on a wholesale roundup of Italians. On March 14, 1891, a mob of 8,000 people stormed the old parish prison, broke into the jail, shot 9 Italian fishermen in their cells, and hanged 2 more. No one was ever indicted.
But there's no doubt that some of them were involved in organized crime, as was Police Chief Hennessy. He was in the pay of one of the Mafia families that was fighting each other, and so the other family killed him. He was no knight in shining armor.
By 1900, the Mafia was stronger than ever in New Orleans and worked in silence, with members belonging to one powerful family with a boss. The strict family code of the Mafia was kept intact as new chapters were established in other cities. Sicilian immigrants to America brought along the Mafia as a culture, not an organization. The Mafia offered them a sense of order in the New World. But it was also a secret criminal enterprise, threatening immigrants with robbery, extortion, kidnapping, even murder. The blending of Sicilian traditions within a crowded, often hostile American context spawned a particular hybrid, the American Mafia, which we'll see posed a new threat to American justice. The Lucania family's dreams of America were shattered by the reality of the tenements of New York when they arrived in 1906. At 700 people per acre, the Lower East Side was more crowded than Bombay. The Sicilian immigrants lived on the streets, trying to recreate the piazza they had known back home. Antonio became a day laborer, and the 5 young Lucanias quickly Americanized their names. Giuseppe became Joseph, Francesca, Fanny, Bartolo, Bart, Concetta, Connie, and Salvatore, Charles. They also changed their last name from Lucania to Luciano. Practically any neighborhood where a large population of Sicilian immigrants lived, the Mafia also existed. At the time, the Mafia was also known as the Black Hand, a group that mainly preyed on fellow Italians. Their main line was an extortion racket. They had a fearsome reputation in the neighborhood, but one policeman fought back.
Tenente Giuseppe Petrosino was the first Italian New York City policeman to ever reach the status of a lieutenant. He was doing a very effective job against the Black Hand. Whenever a man came from Italy, a paisan or a friend of his would bring this man to police headquarters, stand in front of the headquarters until he saw Giuseppe Petrosino and point this dreaded enemy of the Black Hand out.
As the Black Handers grew in size and muscle power, they began harassing the most famous Italian of his day, Enrico Caruso.
The Mafia sent him a letter demanding a $10,000 payment within a week, or meet your debt. Not even the dust of your family will remain. Caruso wisely got in touch with Lieutenant Petrosino and showed him the letter, and he was given round-the-clock bodyguards. Now, if Caruso would have yielded to their demands, I mean, there would have been no end to it.
When he performed at the Metropolitan Opera, Petrosino was assigned to protect him. But no such protection was possible for others. When Petrosino investigated the man-in-the-barrel case, it was too late.
A corpse was discovered in a wooden barrel. Some woman was walking to work, and she was Irish, by the way. She saw this lid open, and there was a piece of clothing hanging out. She opened the lid, and she saw this man stuffed into this barrel and his genitals shoved in his mouth.
Well, Petrosino was an extraordinary individual, mainly because he can be considered to be the founder of the modern Interpol concept. With all these Sicilian criminals who were coming to the United States, he realized that there would have to be some cooperation with the Italian police so that they might be prosecuted or at least removed as undesirable aliens.
In 1909, Petrosino went to Sicily to check out police records. He went through the Italian files and saw many familiar faces from his neighborhood in New York, but his moves were being watched.
On March 12, 1909, he was eating dinner at the Piazza Marina, and he was told to meet parties unknown so many feet around the Garibaldi Garden. And there, 3 men come up to him, pushed him up to a fence, and shot him. It was To me, it was suicide, really. I don't know why he did it, but he was a very courageous man.
In New York, the Mafia was strengthening its hold, and in the melting pot of the Lower East Side, Lucky Luciano met 3 other young immigrants, an Italian from Calabria named Frank Costello, and 2 Jews, Meyer Lansky and Bugsy Siegel. An alliance was forged, which would come to dominate organized crime in the United States and change its character forever. The most important hoodlum of his time was a young Italian named Frankie Yale. He was more than just a 2-bit head-cracking gangster and extortionist.
He was the first celebrity godfather. No question about it. He owned a cigar company with his portrait on the box. He was the Beau Brummel of the Brooklyn underworld and a killer the country over, really.
In New York, as in Sicily, the Mafia ran their local communities, providing services that the government couldn't or wouldn't. Yale was the protector.
His heart went out for the poor people. On holidays, Christmas, Thanksgiving, he would send his men out with baskets of macaroni, canned goods, turkeys, to feed the poor people in his area.
He set himself up as a dispenser of justice. For instance, common robbery, especially of people who were poor, he would simply not tolerate it.
One of Yale's prodigies was forever proud that he was born in the United States, not Naples. He Americanized his name from Alphonse Capone to Al Capone and modeled himself after his mentor, Frankie Yale.
He tutored Al in the ABCs of the underworld. He put Al to work as a bartender and a greeter at the Harvard Inn. There was a dine and dance joint on the Coney Island waterfront. Al showed a lot of potential, really. He was tough. He was a good shot with a gun. With a bat, he was terrific.
But when Capone nearly killed a member of Wild Bill Lovett's White Hand gang, he'd gone too far. By 1919, Capone's violent reputation had spread throughout the Brooklyn docks. He was already a murder suspect in 2 cases. Finally, Frankie Yale decided to send him out to Chicago for his own safety. As we'll see, it was a move that changed the face of organized crime forever. Chicago was never innocent. The city swarmed with pimps and pickpockets, operating in and out of brothels, saloons, and dives of every description. For Chicago's gangsters, the beginning of Prohibition in 1920 was an answered prayer, especially for young Al Capone, who was now under the tutelage of Johnny Torrio. Johnny Torrio was noted for his intelligence rather than his muscle. From the first, Capone reserved his loyalty for Torrio, and Torrio's views automatically became Capone's.
Torrio saw the potential in this man. He was big. He was willing to do what was necessary, meaning to harm somebody, a hit. And he was smart. But before they went into bootlegging, Big Jim Colosimo, Torrio's uncle, refused to invest 1 dime in the bootlegging business. He says, we're doing okay with our houses of prostitution, our gambling. What do we need bootleg booze for? I don't want to tangle with no feds.
Jim Colosimo, the last of the Mustache Petes of Chicago, an old-time crime boss who by 1920, even though he'd only been around 20 or 25 years in the city, was very much out of step with his young contemporaries who were on their way up.
Well, there was only one thing to do. The guy's got to be hit. Uncle or no uncle, the man has to be hit. I mean, here's a business, we can make millions in this bootleg booze.
Big Jim was gunned down as he was leaving his cafe. A cryptic note read, "So long, vampire, so long, lefty." With Big Jim Colosimo out of the way, Torrio and Capone expanded their bootlegging. In 1924, a gangster named Dion O'Banion became troublesome as he started hijacking their liquor.
Dion O'Banion was the boss of the vicious North Side gang. However, O'Banion's demeanor belied what he really was. He was a former choir boy. He ran a flower shop on State Street with his partner Schofield, and he was a gangster of some refinements.
Dion O'Banion became a thorn in Torio's side. Torio put in a call to Brooklyn, Frankie Yale, to come out to do a special job. Frankie takes the train out, orders a floral display for Miguel Merlo's funeral on an appointed day. They came in. You got my flowers? Yes. You from Mike Merlo's? Yes. It's good to see you. Shook hands. Frank held tight while the other two torpedoes opened up on him. Shot him dead. Yale was given $10,000 and $1920 we're talking about. And a 4-carat diamond ring.
O'Banion's funeral was a top mob social event. The streets were so jammed, scalpers demanded $1 for vantage points on buildings. The florist was buried in a $10,000 bronze coffin.
With O'Banion out of the way, the Prohibition War of Chicago really escalates in the next few years as one North Side boss after another is gunned down, and retribution follows.
You see, the thing is not to get the assassin. It's to get the guy that pays the assassin. They tried to ambush Capone. Torio was a victim of a shooting. Decided to pack it in, and he handed over the whole of Chicago as, Al, it's all yours. I'm leaving. He got, he came close to dying, and he handed over the whole works to Capone.
By 1927, Al Capone had become one of Chicago's top media celebrities.
But his reputation has been somewhat inflated because he loves to be interviewed by journalists. He makes himself available to journalists, and he talks on about this and that. He's not very bright. I mean, even for a gangster, Al Capone is pretty stupid. But the journalists take these maunderings, these random reflections of Al Capone, and turn them into sentences and paragraphs. So he's made to seem intelligent.
Al Capone loved to go down the street in his big black limousine with bodyguards surrounding him. He loved to go to ballparks and have the crowd cheer when he entered his box.
Chicago's most notorious citizen, Al Capone, king of the gangsters, appears in a new role, that of public benefactor, when he sets up soup kitchens to feed unemployed.
If it wasn't for our friend Al Caponeo opening this here White House on 935 South State Street, we wouldn't eat.
But what the Chicago Capone really enjoyed was the Chicago of the nightclubs and its more than 10,000 speakeasies.
There were so many nightclubs that you couldn't wade through them. I played the piano, I sung, I played the musical saw, and I never cared too much for dancing, and I didn't consider myself a flapper. I considered myself a Southern lady.
Rio Burke knew Capone well. She was married to Dominic Roberto, one of his lieutenants.
He was always having him out to the house with a group of men. And we had one long table, and they all sat at the table. The men, women didn't, we stayed in the background. Served them and cooked for them. And
Dominic's line of work became more apparent when Rio's maid found a huge gunny sack in the closet.
it was loaded with all kinds of guns, pistols, sawed-off shotguns, every kind of guns. So we put it back. And when Dominic came home, I said, honey, what are all those guns doing downstairs in that gunny sack? Well, he says, some of the boys are going hunting. They went hunting, all right. And then, of course, you know, I'd hear things, but he wouldn't let me socialize. And the wives did not socialize. If they had business to take care of, they did it somewhere else, in Al's office or a place like that. They would never do it in a place like our house.
Capone always had someone to do his thinking for him. It's Johnny Torrio at first, and then after Torrio, retires or is retired and returns to New York in 1926 is a man named Greasy Thumb Guzik, Jake Guzik, who was a Jewish gangster and is sort of the man who is at Capone's right hand, telling him what to do, how to handle his money, and so on.
Throughout all the vicious years, Capone saw himself as merely providing services for others. I give the people what it wants. I've given people the light pleasures, and all I get is abuse.
He developed contact with the New York mob. He was operating in the city and the suburbs, and one by one, he ruthlessly closed down all of his competitors.
Capone was buying booze from all over the country, doing business with Frankie Yale. A lot of trucks were being hijacked before they even left Brooklyn, so he was suspicious. Capone had a friend in Brooklyn, James Fauzi D'Amato, who he asked to keep an eye on Yale. Fauzi wound up dead. On July 1st, 1928, around 4 p.m., Yale was drinking in his speakeasy. A call came in. Something happened to your wife. Runs out to his car. Suddenly he spots a black Nash trailing him. Speeds up. The other car gained on him. Hey, Frankie! That's it. They hit him. Machine gun, shotgun, and pistol fire. And to make, this is true, to make sure the car came to a screeching halt as Yale's car crashed into a building. One of the gunmen leaped out, drew a .45 automatic, ran up to the fallen Yale, and pumped the whole clip into his head. Frankie Yale, the first celebrity godfather, received the biggest gangland funeral in the nation. There were 250 cars in a procession, plus 38 flower cars, and the casket he rested in was a nickel and silver casket that cost $1928 now we're talking about. 15 grand. There was at least 12 to 15,000 mourners. Alphonse Capone was and is still the most famous gangster of the 20th century. But the thing is, who is the man who started him on his way to becoming what he was, a celebrity gangster? Frankie Yale, who he modeled his life after.
But the bloodiest event was yet to come. When news of the St. Valentine's Day massacre broke in the Chicago press, few people could believe what had happened. It was an event unparalleled in gangland history, and a sad day for American justice. With rival bootleggers eliminated, Al Capone faced a challenge from the lone survivor, George Bugs Moran. In the struggle for control of Chicago's liquor trade, Moran had twice tried to kill Capone and failed. On February 14, 1929, 7 Moran gangsters were huddled in a cold warehouse, awaiting a shipment of whiskey. According to a housewife next door, a Cadillac pulled up and 4 men went inside, 2 in uniform, leading the way. She assumed it was a police raid. And so did the 7 men inside. They lined up against the wall, expecting to be arrested. The machine gun swung back and forth 3 times, first at the level of their heads, then chests, then stomachs. Over 1,000 bullets shattered their bone and cartilage at point-blank range. A pool of blood formed 40 feet wide. Capone was in Florida at the time, but it's clear his gang did it. It was the most notorious example of bootlegging violence, and it's ultimately the catalyst for Capone's downfall. For the 2 main triggermen of the massacre, Albert Anselmi and John Scalise, there was a cruel reward. Capone assembled a room full of mobsters to honor them for their recent deeds. Capone heard that his guests of honor were part of a conspiracy to dethrone him.
In the course of the dinner, Al Capone takes a baseball bat and beats them to death, hammers away at their heads, and they're killed. The bodies are carted off, and the dinner continues as though nothing happened.
Get these criminals behind prison walls. It's too bad that we even have to pay for their support. Their extermination would be much more satisfactory.
Already these rats are running for cover. And it's the duty of every law-abiding citizen to help them from the hiding place and see that when caught, they are treated what they really are, rats.
President Hoover responded to the public's outrage. Parallel investigations were launched with Prohibition agent Elliot Ness and the Justice Department searching for bootlegging evidence, and the IRS's Frank Wilson looking for proof of taxable income. He wanted to know why the high-living Capone never filed a tax return. Like Capone, Elliot Ness loved the limelight and guaranteed coverage by telling the press in advance when he planned a raid.
Somebody spilled the beans, and now Prohibition agents are spilling the beer. Thousands of gallons with plenty of kick. There's no doubt about it, the raid is a smashing success. Talk about showers, how'd you like to stand under this one?
The IRS men Elmer Irie and Frank Wilson operated in secrecy and obscurity and were able to infiltrate Capone's organization. Although Capone never signed any checks, they uncovered $165,000 worth of taxable income. But Wilson wasn't satisfied. He wanted evidence to put Capone away for good. He needed an informer, but no one was talking.
Omerta is actually the Mafia law of silence. When you become a member of the Mafia, you take an oath that you will, with love and secrecy, you cannot expose the secrets of the organization, okay? I'm sorry, you know, it's absolute and it's enforced.
It should be noted that the very strictness and harshness of the Code of Omerta contains implicit in it the very fact that informing is a possibility.
Artful Eddie O'Hare was a lawyer, one of Capone's lawyers. He ran racetracks for the Capones. He had a son named Butch on whom he doted, peppered his conversation with references to my son Butch. He wants Butch to be able to go to Annapolis, and he can't because Artful Eddie is a gangster. So as Eddie told the story, he turns against Al Capone, provides evidence for Al Capone's tax case. And so Artful Eddie is sort of pardoned. He becomes a good citizen. The Capones learn about this treachery and kill him. But Eddie O'Hare is indeed a Navy hero during World War II, and O'Hare Airport in Chicago is named for this son of a gangster.
As a last desperate attempt, Capone offered $1.5 million in cash to IRS man Elmer Irie. Irie turned him down.
Mr. Alphonse Capone, alias Mr. Al Brown, alias the Big Shot, has met the enemy and he is there. Now for a change, they're taking him for a ride. And so, up until 1940, Mr. Capone will be Mr. 40,886. Let that be a good lesson to you. Always be sure and pay your income tax.
Capone was not put away by Elliot Ness. It was the pencil-pushing intellectuals like Elmer Irie and Frank Wilson who did the tax work against Al Capone. Elliot Ness is a footnote figure.
In 1947, suffering from syphilis, pneumonia, and a brain hemorrhage, 48-year-old Al Capone died. According to Jake Guzik, he was as nutty as a fruitcake.
He had syphilis for a long time, but he never did anything about it. I don't think he believed it. And then, of course, he did die. He lost his mind, you know.
Historians have been unusually kind to Al Capone. Recently, Al Capone was retried and found innocent in a mock trial, I believe, by the American Bar Association. And now in Chicago, they're opening up an Al Capone museum along the Gold Coast.
With Capone toppled through tax evasion and prohibition on the way out, the speakeasies of the 20s became the nightclubs of the 30s and provided the gangsters with a legal income and a front. When black jazz musicians worked in gangster clubs, it brought together lives on the social outskirts of conventional society. At a time when blacks and whites had little contact as peers, the gangsters and jazzmen shared a communal nature of experience that transcended race.
I suppose the gangsters were as racist as most white people were at the time, but some of them did like jazz. Some of the jazzmen have said, I wish they still owned the nightclubs. You could trust them. If they said they were going to pay you, they paid you. And sometimes they provided services.
There's a story about how one band picked up a singer down south and brought him to Chicago to the major black club, which was of course owned by the Capones. When the man's white employer came up to try and get him back, he was beaten up by the club's bouncers and sent back south. The jazz singer got to stay in Chicago.
And I love to sing, shortening bread with a hunk of sugar cane in my mouth.
At the time, Joey Lewis was a promising cabaret singer.
Yes, sirree, I'm from this house.
The Green Mill was a jumping speakeasy on the north side, booking the top nightclub acts of the era into there. Joey Lewis was booked into the Green Mill. He received an offer to perform elsewhere while under contract to the syndicate-controlled place. He broke the contract and was viciously slashed in the neck, allegedly by Machine Gun Jack McGurn. Afterwards, all hopes of a singing career were abandoned, and Joey Lewis had to change careers and become a comedian.
I should have a bicarbonate float, but I'll have a champagne cocktail instead.
In some cases, the gangsters control the performers, especially if they have gambling habits. Joey Lewis, for example, was an inveterate gambler, often lost, and so he was beholden to the gangsters who ran the gambling games that he frequented. So he was one of their favorite couriers.
Here's Milton Berle, Broadway comedian. Gentlemen, I'm very happy to be here tonight. I'm a little unprepared. I didn't know they were going to call on me till 6 weeks ago.
Milton Berle is a man who started his gambling in the 1930s when his career as an entertainer begins in nightclubs. He later estimates that he lost about $3 million over the years gambling. Again, these connections, the gambling debts, put him into contact with gangsters.
How old are you?
39.
39?
Yes.
Shy 10.
Jimmy Durante is another example. In that case, it's not he that does the gambling, but his manager, Luke Clayton, who is an inveterate gambler, and so Jimmy Durante often appears at gangster clubs. Lena Horne starts her showbiz career as a dancer at the Cotton Club in the early 1930s. Her father is Ted Horne, who is a numbers boss in Pittsburgh. He's a gambling man, a fancy man in the black underworld. And at one point, Lena Horne wanted to leave the chorus line at the Cotton Club and perform somewhere else. And her father was trying to arrange that with the employers at the Cotton Club. They disagreed with him, and to prove their point, they beat him up and shoved his head into a toilet. So Lena Horne stayed at the Cotton Club. She says that she was so young that she was not offered to gangsters, as most of the dancers were in that club. Most of the dancers had certain, shall we say, social responsibilities to favored guests of the club, but she was too young for that.
Baby, I don't want no more loving. No, I'd rather be all alone. So when my payday comes around, I call my money on my own. Let me forget you, baby.
The connections among the mob and show business last for decades. They start in Prohibition because the bootleggers are providing the booze to the nightclubs, but those connections last for a long time. Copacabana Club in New York, for example, is one of the most glamorous nightclubs in the city in the 40s and 50s. It's owned secretly by Frank Costello, and its season in the fall is usually opened by Joey Lewis, the mob's favorite comedian.
But underneath the glittering surface lay a world of seething violence based on money and murder. Capone's Chicago may have been the scene of the most violent and spectacular crimes, but New York City contributed the most significant Italian bootleggers. Significant both for the time and for the future of organized crime. By the mid-1920s, New York gained its most powerful leader to date, a crude, stocky man named Giuseppe Masseria, or Joe the Boss. Joe Bonanno said Joe the Boss attacked a plate of spaghetti as if he were a drooling mastiff. Joe the Boss gathered around him a group of criminally talented young men, known as the Young Turks, including Lucky Luciano, Frank Costello, and Vito Genovese. After Frankie Yale's assassination in 1928, Joe the Boss reached new heights of power. Yet the total control he sought was denied him by the presence of Salvatore Maranzano, who headed a group of gangsters from the Sicilian village of Castellamarese del Golfo. Maranzano encroached on Joe the Boss's bootlegging operations, hijacking truckloads of his booze. Joe the Boss struck back, and there followed killings of Maranzano's soldiers. The Castellamarese War had begun. Joe the Boss passed a death sentence on the entire Castellamarese clan. Maranzano retaliated by asking Lucky Luciano to betray Joe the Boss by murdering him. Luciano had always refused Maranzano's requests to kill Joe the Boss. For one such refusal, Maranzano slashed his face so badly he was permanently disfigured. Lucky to escape with his life, he was given the nickname Lucky by Meyer Lansky. As Masseria's gang began suffering heavier losses, there were defections. Many of the Young Turks objected to the constant struggle for power within the Mafia. Lucky decided to kill Joe the Boss because he had easy access to him.
On April 15, 1931, Joe Masseria was invited to a restaurant in Coney Island. Luciano was there together with Vito Genovese and Ciro Terranova. Terranova and Genovese did not stay long. Lucky and Masseria were left in the restaurant playing cards. Charlie Lucky went to the men's room. 4 gunmen came in and riddled Masseria to death. The 4 gunmen are Vito Genovese, Joe Donis, Albert Anastasia, and Bugsy Siegel. So to end the Castellamarese War, they had to hit Masseria. So they betrayed their own boss. After that, Salvatore Maranzano declared himself boss of all bosses, capo di tutti capi. And he laid down the families and the whole network and who was going to be in charge of the families, you know.
Maranzano set up 5 crime families under him. But Maranzano knew that if he was to remain the boss of all bosses, he would have to eliminate some rivals. Top of his list, the man he had recently made his second in command, Lucky Luciano. Although both Sicilian, there was a huge gulf between Salvatore Maranzano and Lucky Luciano. To Lucky, Maranzano's old world airs were all nonsense. What had meaning for Lucky was making money, doing business. Maranzano didn't want anything to do with Jews. Lucky's closest ally was Meyer Lansky, a Jew. Lucky was tipped off and hired 5 killers. Posing as IRS men, they arrived at Maranzano's Park Avenue office. For the first time, Maranzano had no bodyguards. The killers stabbed him and pumped lead into his body. The boss of all bosses was dead.
The bosses of each family agreed to cooperate with other ethnic organized crime groups, such as Lepke Buckholder, Meyer Lansky, and Bugsy Siegel.
The friendship of Meyer Lansky and Charlie Lucky Luciano in New York becomes a prototype of a very important connection for the future of organized crime. After the Italians take over organized crime in the 1930s, the classic pattern is the head of a mafia family in a given city has at his right hand a Jewish advisor. Lansky's the prototype, but there are many examples. Jake Guzik in Chicago performs these functions for Capone.
Lansky and Siegel started an organization called Murder Incorporated, sometimes known as La Kosher Nostra.
Murder Incorporated was an execution squad. It was permanently on call to be dispatched to various parts of the country for any members of the syndicate that wanted to use its services.
These people, you know, there's many people who believe that anybody could have went to Murder Incorporated and have their wife assassinated or whatever, okay, for a fee. This is totally wrong. They were only available as killers to the underworld. Any gang in the nation that had any power in the underworld could use their services. And the best part about it is, when they did the hit, they didn't have no connection with the victim at all. They would come in from another town, somebody would finger the victim, he would do the job, and hightail it out of town, and that was it.
But the Mafia wasn't all murder. Luciano saw it as a business. In 1931, he set up the Commission as a nationwide board of directors.
Luciano is known as the man who Americanized the Mafia. What's usually meant by that is that he eliminated a lot of these old superstitions and taboos and prejudices. He made it less clannish and more of an active business involved in the work of making money illegally.
The old ways and the old leaders were finally dead, and Charles Lucky Luciano was at last king. By 1933, he had transformed the Mafia into a fearsome money-making machine, a national syndicate that would one day do business equal to that of the nation's 10 largest industrial corporations combined. I'm Bill Curtis.